his role as a watchman, chapters 4 to 7. A watchman, like a person on a tower, letting the people of the town know when the enemy's coming in. It's interesting. It's kind of an odd watchman because his message is that they're all going to get wiped out anyway. So you might think, well, what is he trying to save them from? But we'll talk about that a bit today. He wants the people to... He's not... The disaster is inevitable, but he's very interested in their moral response to the disaster, because as far as Ezekiel is concerned, the nation of Israel will continue. And the remnant of God's plan for the people of Israel will continue into the future. So it's very important that whatever worldly disaster happens, the people carry with them into the future a recognition of their own culpability in what has happened, and a faith in Yahweh for what he's going to bring in the future. So he's really trying to prepare the people for a much bigger future than anything any of them had in mind, and a much more negative assessment of themselves than anybody is really eager to embrace. So that's his role as a watchman. We see that, at least in these early years, for about 7 years, he's divided between public oracles, which begin with this phrase, "Thus says Adonai Yahweh," so he tells the people those, and then private oracles that are for him and him alone. He will reveal those later, but for the time being, as far as the glorious vision of Israel's future, he appears to be the only one who knows anything about it. And then after Jerusalem falls, then he will bring that out. And sometimes people ask why that is, but that makes perfect sense. You can't console people for a disaster that hasn't happened yet, especially if they don't think that it's going to happen. Once the disaster happens, and then everybody wakes up and says, "Oh, I guess he was right," then he can bring them a message of consolation. But for the time being, he and Jeremiah both, and Jeremiah, incidentally, is still alive, living in the city of Jerusalem, while Ezekiel's doing all of these things, saying very much the same kind of message, is in the same situation. He's preaching a disaster that nobody believes will happen, so he can't meaningfully offer them consolation because they don't believe any of it. But it's important for Jeremiah to believe it. It's important for Ezekiel to believe it because they have to stand alone in the face of opposition. That's kind of what today's message is about. Last week we saw this vision of Yahweh abandoning the temple in chapters 8, 9, 10, 11. It's the only really vision of that event. All the way back in Leviticus chapter 16 in the Torah of Moses, the day of Yom Kippur is intended to make sure that Yahweh stays in his temple, that he's present among the people of Israel. Now at last, he has to leave. And we have a description of that in Ezekiel. And as we saw last week, the Mount of Olives plays a very big role here, and that will play a very big role in Zechariah, apocalyptic literature, even some of the sayings of Jesus, because you head east of the city of Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives is the place where Yahweh makes his exit. Yes?
That's why the Indiana Jones movies are mistaken. Because abandoning the temple means abandoning the ark.
Yes.
And in the Indiana Jones movie, they portray it as though Yahweh is still there. That's the reason these guys belt.
Right.
But that wouldn't be true. Yahweh's not there.
Yeah, the only thing that makes the Ark of the Covenant lethal is Yahweh's presence.
Right.
The Ark itself is not able to blow up heads or melt faces off of German Nazis, though I love Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know, Steven Spielberg's a great theologian, you know. Well, I always thought, it's funny. It's a great movie, and there is a lot of that biblical imagery. Of course, he turns the cloud into ghosts, and he turns the fire into these other things, and it's all Hollywood and everything. But, it's a cool movie. But it's not accurate, and most certainly the ark was not taken into Egypt in the days of, I think Rehoboam is really the theory that Shishak, Pharaoh of Egypt, took the ark back with him. But that can't be the case, probably. We hear references to it as late as the time of Josiah. So the ark was there. Whatever became of it, we don't really know. But what is dangerous is Yahweh himself. Again, not because he's bad, but because he's holy, because people are not holy, and therefore too much of a good thing, at least for us in our present condition. So that was last week. We have that vision of Yahweh leaving. Now in chapters 12 to 19, all of these follow on the tail end of that initial vision. So this is our first vision, his calling. This is our second vision. Ezekiel's taken by the hair, taken all the way to Jerusalem and sees all of these things. Then again, he's in a stupor. He tells the exiles what they've seen. And if we count before his third vision, chapters 12 to 19, or before he gives a datable division of his text, there are 14 oracles. For me, as a reader of ancient books, 14 is a significant number. It's a very tidy figure. These oracles belong together, and what they do is they tell us that now he's being opposed by the people. He's been preaching what he's been preaching, he's been saying what he's been saying, but now he comes into definite opposition. And so I call this lesson a prophet opposed. The years are 592 to 591, and they all follow on the tail end of this vision. Let me see if there's any other questions or comments. If not, then I'll just jump right into the lesson here on page 39. And this lesson will get us about halfway through the book. Ezekiel's about 40 chapters. 40, what is it? 48. So this will get us about halfway through. So it goes back to the exiles. And each of these 14 oracles begins with the phrase, the word of Yahweh came to me. The word of Yahweh came to me. Word of Yahweh came to me. The first we encountered last week as part of his vision, where he receives the news that the people living in exile are actually Yahweh's remnant. They're the ones who are going to carry forward the promises, and the people in Jerusalem are not. And then we come to a series of 3 oracles that show Ezekiel back in Babylonia doing what he does, which is prophetic, phrase I'm looking for, enacted prophecy. He's playing out visually for the people to see. So, in chapter 12, beginning in the 3rd verse, he's instructed to mime the approaching total exile of Jerusalem. What does he do? He packs his possessions in the daytime, and he stages a secret departure in the evening. He digs through the wall of his house and passes through the opening, shouldering his pack, hiding his face as if to escape without being seen. In the second oracle, he told to the people who asked, people are going to ask, what are you doing? So the elders come to the house and observe Ezekiel's strange behavior. They're naturally going to ask, what are you doing? He is to tell them. He's portraying the exile of Zedekiah, the king of Jerusalem, as well as all of the other Israelites in Jerusalem. Zedekiah will escape near the end of the city's siege through a breach in a wall. The Babylonians will capture him, scatter his troops, and bring him to Babylon in chains. The remaining citizens will survive to testify to Yahweh's sovereignty. Only a few will be spared to express repentance for the nation's grievous sins. And thirdly, it's a sandwich. There's an explanation in the middle, prophetic activity on the front end. On the back end, Ezekiel eats his meals while shuddering, his tremors a sign pointing to the horror of the coming invasion of the holy city. So he's back to his old tricks. He's enacting the future before it happens.
I would not want to live next to him.
I don't think he would make good dinner company. Yeah.
There are some really good bas-reliefs of exiles coming from Israel, and they are often depicted with a little bag on their back, just like in this passage. It looks kind of like a gunny sack, but it's over their shoulder, and they often have their hand right in front of their face, like this, as they're headed off into exile. Pretty much like Ezekiel, that's what he's doing, hiding his face. The hand is right in front of their face.
No, that's probably true. Part of it is anticipating what's going to happen, but part of it is the cultural language and symbolism that we find in the artwork that the people would immediately recognize.
Do other prophets, is that common for the other prophets to enact?
It's not uncommon. We find it in Jeremiah. We find it all the way far as back as Isaiah. And so prophets give expression to things both by what they say and also by what they do. And so some scholars call that enacted prophecy. And I used an example a week or two ago. We still use it in politics and culture today. There are ways of saying a lot without saying words. They've talked about this for years, but when Princess Diana, who had so much trouble with the royal family, back in the day, and she died, and they brought her casket out in long processional, Queen Elizabeth, who is never says much, when Diana passed by, did this. Oh, they've talked about that for years. Because when you don't say much, saying very little can say a lot. And so that had a big impact on everybody. Or I mentioned, I think, a couple weeks ago when Nancy Pelosi tore the speech of... She didn't say anything, but I think everybody got the message that she was trying to get across. And so enacted prophecy is like that. Sometimes actions speak louder than words, and the prophets speak a great deal by doing things. And they also create a situation, especially when people are doubtful about what it is that they're saying, to continue sending the message without explicitly saying anything. This happens to a lot in Jesus' ministry in the New Testament. He speaks in parables. People, and then he says things like, "He who has an ear, let him hear." Well, that's a way of challenging the listener. What is it you think I'm saying up here? And then the ball is on their court to decide what is exactly being said. And there's a lot of that in enacted prophecy too. The burden of interpretation is on the viewer. What do they think is going on? Yeah.
In the beginning of 12, he says, Israel, who have ears but don't hear, who have eyes and don't, just like your...
Yeah, and that carries forward in the New Testament. Israel who has ears but don't hear, they have eyes but do not see. A cultural situation can come up where people need to communicate, but there's certain things that are not publicly you're allowed to say. And so a whole subtext of communication happens where people say things without directly saying them.
Especially when you're driving.
When you're driving? Politics, too. So that's interesting. That's a good question. I try to bring it into our own time because we live in a time, too, where you can't really always say what you really think in today's social, moral, political climate. And so people come up with indirect ways of communicating. Because they still need to communicate, but they know what they have to say isn't what they're supposed to say. And so there it is. Now, at that point, yeah, Charlie.
As Christians, don't we have to do somewhat to speak the truth?
At a certain point, yeah. So the question is, as Christians, don't we have a duty at some point to raise our flag and let it be known where we stand? I think at some point, yes. The question is exactly when and where is the most efficient time to do so. Be as wise as a serpent and as a... Jesus is a good example of this. He really waits till the very end of his ministry to show his hand. And he shows it at just the right time and just the right way. And he knows that the moment he shows his hand, what will happen. So it doesn't necessarily mean one time is as good as another, but if one is indirect and if one is not forthcoming, it needs to be in the service of ultimately coming out with it at the right time and not sheer cowardice. And I think that's probably the case, yeah. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I've been working with his biography lately, is a good example of that. He was a German pastor in Hitler's Nazi Germany. He had to be very careful about who he was open with, about what it was he was doing and what he believed. It wasn't out of cowardice, and at a certain point he was hung for his beliefs and imprisoned. But he did realize that there was a window within which he had to be wise about how he operated. And probably that's a moral question that there's no one-size-fit-all answer for. But that's a good question. Because at any rate, you do have statements, if you deny me in front of men, my heavenly Father will deny you. So the issue cannot be that we're afraid to own our fidelity to Christ. We have to own up to that. And the question is when and where and for what reasons. That's a good question. So Ezekiel's doing all of these things, and now he comes into opposition. And incidentally, in the first four people that oppose him are exactly the same four groups that we encountered in his vision of Jerusalem. The religious leaders, the elders, the people, the general populace, and the women specifically are singled out as their own group. So turning to page 40 here, we've got a couple oracles, the first of which deal with the people. Now, what are the people in Ezekiel's day saying? What are they saying in Jerusalem? What are they saying in Babylonia? What is the popular wisdom of the day? Chapter 12, verse 21. Son of man, what is this proverb that you have about the land of Israel? The days grow long and every vision comes to nothing. Son of man, behold what the house of Israel is saying. The vision he sees is for many days now, and he prophesies times far off. So we get the idea, there's two sayings, one in Jerusalem and one in Babylonia. In Jerusalem, the saying is skepticism. We have been listening to the prophets for hundreds of years, and nothing they ever say happens. One moment the prophets are promising salvation and freedom. The next they're announcing gloom and disaster. Neither of those things has happened. What is a sober person to do? You shrug your shoulders and say, yeah, we've heard it all before. And that's understandable. You can kind of get your head into the time and the place and say, okay, yeah, I can see how people would say that. In Babylonia, the saying is more specific to Ezekiel. His name is apparently passing around among the people. Some of the exiles seem to think that his prophecies are true, but they're consoling themselves with the fact that they probably won't live to see them happen. And that's probably not something we cannot identify with either. If you get the idea that the troubles that are going on in the country are such that they're pretty disastrous, but you might not actually have to see them. And that's hard when you have kids, because I got 4 kids. They're going to have to see them. So good luck to the kids. I won't have to deal with it. So they say, well, the days are far off. Yahweh instructs Ezekiel to disabuse the people of both illusions. Chapter 12, verse 23 says, the time is at hand. And this is a typo here. Every vision. That's my computer doing autocorrect. The fulfillment of every vision. Now there Ezekiel's talking about, I think, the destruction of Jerusalem. It's coming up real quick. There shall be no more delay. Every word that I speak shall be fulfilled. In chapter 13, he comes toe-to-toe with other prophets who are saying the opposite thing that he is. And of course, we can all identify with this. Pastor so-and-so says X, Pastor such-and-such says Y. These scholars say this thing over here, those scholars say that thing over there. And I think that's true even in our own time. Even religious leaders seem to disagree with each other a significant amount of the time. And so the ordinary layperson is left with too many voices of authority on the table. And then the question is, well, who do I listen to? The problem is not that no one speaks for God. It's that there are too many voices speaking for God at the same time, and they don't always agree with each other. This is actually an old problem, and I think one of the things that Jeremiah and Ezekiel help us realize, that's an old problem. They dealt with that in ancient Israel.
I think in the modern world it's exacerbated by the amount of podcasts that are available. Where
Sure.
years ago you didn't have them, so you had a little more limited, array of voices. Now they're everywhere, and everybody can hear them all.
Well, there's much less information control. People are going to hear multiple voices saying different things at the same time on their phones, on their podcasts, and you just scroll through them, and it's
Oh, Mr. Lewis's pop-up.
and I'm one of them, right? So you're like, oh, there's Mr. Lewis on TikTok. I posted one today on the virgin birth. You have to look it up. See. But there's so many different voices. There's a positive side to that. Some of us kind of grew up in an atmosphere where the pastors were these local tin pot gods who whatever they said went. And nobody questioned that. Once you get out of that narrow world, you realize that there are other ways of looking at things. So that's valuable. But it can create confusion. And so you get the idea that Ezekiel and Jeremiah are a minority report. Most people aren't saying what they're saying. And a lot of prophets are saying a lot of different kinds of things. So in chapter 13, I'm going to actually read this in its entirety out of the ESV here. So he's dealt with the people. People have proverbs. The prophets say this and nothing happens, and who knows what to believe. That's the voice of the people. What about the religious leaders, the prophets? The word of Yahweh came to me, chapter 13, verse 1. Now verse 2. Son of man, prophesy against the prophets of Israel who are prophesying. Say to those who prophesy, here's the key phrase, from their own hearts. They're saying what they feel. Hear the word of Yahweh. Thus says the word, this would be Adonai Yahweh. Woe to the foolish prophets who follow their own spirit and have seen nothing. Your prophets have been like jackals among ruins, O Israel. You have not gone up into the breaches or built up a wall for the house of Israel that it might stand in battle in the day of the Lord. They have seen false visions and lying divinations. They say, declares Yahweh, when Yahweh has not sent them. And yet they expect him to fulfill their word. Have you not seen a false vision and uttered a lying divination whenever you have said, declares Yahweh, although I have not spoken? So they're prophesying what they feel led to say, but God has not really spoken to them. Therefore, thus says Adonai Yahweh, because you have uttered falsehood and seen lying visions, I am against you, declares Adonai Yahweh. My hand will be against the prophets who see false visions, who give lying divinations. They shall not be in the council of my people, nor be enrolled in the register of the house of Israel, nor shall they enter the land of Israel. And you shall know that I am Adonai Yahweh. They're not going to be among the exiles who return and build the future of Israel. And the things they say will never come to pass. Precisely because they have misled my people, saying peace, and there is no peace. Because when the people build a wall, these prophets smear it with whitewash. They say to those who smear it with whitewash that it shall fall, or say to those who smear it with whitewash that they will fall. There will be a deluge of rain, and you, O great hailstones, will fall, and a stormy wind break out. In other words, what they're saying isn't really protecting the people. They're building a weak wall. They're building a wall that when the rain, the storms come, will not stand. And they cover it over with whitewash to make it look good, to make it appealing, but in the long run, it doesn't have any staying power. And so the test of genuine, you might say, what's the test of genuine prophecy? It's whether something holds over the long term. It's not whether it looks good in the immediate, but will it actually hold over the long term? Verse 12, when the wall falls, will it not be said to you, where is the coating with which you smeared it? Thus says Adonai Yahweh, I will make a stormy wind break out in my wrath. There shall be a deluge of rain in my anger, great hailstones in wrath to make a full end. I will break down the wall that you have smeared with whitewash and bring it down to the ground, that its foundations will be laid bare. When it falls, you shall perish in the midst of it. I like that. You shall perish, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. And then he says, thus will I spend my wrath on the wall and upon those who have smeared it with whitewash, and I will say to you, the wall is no more, nor those who smeared it. The prophets of Israel who prophesied concerning Jerusalem saw visions of peace for her when there was no peace, declares Adonai Yahweh. And I laugh because they say, you will perish and then you will know that I am the Lord. But I think that helps us see that the word of Ezekiel is not individualistic. It's across generations. The point is that people over the long term, across generations, will see that Yahweh has spoken through Ezekiel, even if they don't see it in their own time. Later generations will look back and see it. It's very important that the prophets are in it for the long game. Really, the key with the false prophets is that they speak to their own people in their own time for what is immediately urgent to them. But they don't really speak over the big picture. And Ezekiel and Jeremiah are speaking a large picture that people aren't going to be able to see, except in retrospect. And that, of course, is their burden, because they're not always going to see the vindication of their word in their own lifetime. They're going to be mocked and spat upon and persecuted in their own lifetime. But later generations are going to look back. And when they do look back, they're going to have to cope with the fact that they may have known what it was that they were talking about. So I think that's what's going on there, yeah.
I think it's humorous, at least, and interesting that St. Paul draws from this passage of the whitewashed wall and uses it as slam to the high priest in the Sanhedrin, in the book of Acts, because he was testifying before the Sanhedrin.
You got the passage in front of you?
Yeah, it's in Acts 23, near the beginning of the passage, of the chapter. Anyway, the high priest didn't like something Paul said. He told somebody to slap him on the mouth. And Paul said, "Oh, God will slap you, you whitewashed wall." And apparently at the moment, Paul wasn't aware it was the high priest. But later he said, "Well, I'm not supposed to say bad things about him." Anyway, he does draw from this passage.
Well, Paul has Ezekiel like water on high pressure. He's just got it right there the moment he needs it. There's a lot of stuff in Paul out of Ezekiel. I was not aware of that one. That's interesting. A whitewashed wall, that's definitely a metaphor right out of the...
That's not a compliment.
No, it's not. Well, and there's a lot of discussion about how to translate the Hebrew there. Whatever it is, it's a wall that hasn't been mortared for the long term. It's been put together for short-term use. It's not really going to last through the storms of the weather that are coming. And to whitewash it is to make it look cleaner and more solid than it actually is. And then, so that one for the people. The people have a saying that the prophets say things and never happens. And Ezekiel says it's going to come speedily. It's going to come in your own lifetime. You're going to see this. The prophets are prophesying what the people want to hear. And so they're the popular speakers of the day. But Ezekiel says what they say, it's not going to happen. And it'll take a later generation looking back to realize that. Finally, in chapter 13, verses 17 to 32, he addresses then the women of the community. And we've seen Ezekiel do that last week and the week before, that the women are a power in their own right. Outside the leaders and outside the people, they're a power in their own right, and he addresses them separately. Chapter 13, verse 17, Son of man, set your face against the daughters of your people, who prophesy out of their own hearts. Prophesy against them and say, Thus says Adonai Yahweh, woe to the women who sew magic bands on the wrists and make veils for the heads of person of every stature in the hunt for souls. Will you hunt down souls belonging to my people and keep your own souls alive? You've profaned me among my people for handfuls of barley, pieces of bread, putting to death souls who should not die, keeping alive souls who should not live, by your lying to my people who listen to lies. Therefore, thus says Adonai Yahweh, behold, I am against your magic bands with which you hunt the souls like birds. I will tear them from your arms. I will let the souls whom you hunt go free, souls like birds. Your veils I will tear off and deliver my people out of your hand. They shall be no more in your hand as prey, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. Because you have disheartened the righteous falsely, although I have not grieved him. And you have encouraged the wicked that he should not turn from his evil way to save his life. You shall no more see false visions nor practice divination. I will deliver my people out of your hand. You shall know that I am Yahweh. So we have this idea that along with the prophets, there are some of the women in exile who are basically fortune tellers. They're fortune tellers. And they claim to be able to predict who will survive and who won't. And they have talismans or amulets that they sell for food to give people reassurance that they will be okay in the long run.
I went to one of those stores the other day.
Were you?
No, in like Detroit.
Peddlers of positivity. Maybe is a way. They peddle positivity for a price. Of course, Ezekiel's charges that they're only looking, what do they get for it? Just food and bread. They're looking out for their own welfare. They don't have any high visions of anything. They're just trying to survive. And in order to survive, they peddle talismans and prophecies of what people want to hear, and people buy it up. People buy it up. So kind of alongside the official prophets, there's a significant number of women who are sort of informal prophets. And they speak to the people, and Ezekiel's not too happy with them either. And now he comes to the elders in chapter 14, the last of the four groups, and he looks very alone indeed. Yeah.
Before we go to 14, would you be willing to weigh in on the whole idea of prophets as we come to the New Testament? Because there are people called prophets in the New Testament, there are people called prophets today.
Sure.
Sectors of Christianity put a lot of emphasis on that on the one side, and then it's sort of the opposite. There's sort of the non-profit organizations who don't believe they exist. But there's quite a bit of diversity within Christian circles of the whole idea of a prophet. I don't know whether that's a rabbit trail you don't want to even go down, but
Rabbit trails are my fave.
okay, well, then this is the rabbit.
This is the rabbit.
Bushes.
The hole goes deep.
Find it.
Well, we get a lot of this at YWAM because at the university where you teach and I teach too, they're more charismatic. And so within the charismatic tradition, it's not uncommon for someone to say, I have a word from the Lord. Becky's not here. She hates that sort of thing.
Well, I get questions from students virtually everywhere I go.
Yeah.
They're not all on board with it either, but they don't know what to do.
It's tricky because if someone says, I have a word from the Lord, well, you don't want to dismiss them. Maybe they do. But then the question becomes, what is the criteria for determining what an authentic word from the Lord is?
Yeah, that's true. Who is the word for?
Right.
They got the word, they don't, they got the word from the Lord. It's probably more for them than it is for someone else.
Well, and are they, as this passage says, prophesying out of their own spirit? However, it might be well meant. It doesn't mean that they're malicious. But are they prophesying just their own feelings? Or do they actually have a legitimate thing to say? So I guess one thing, the Hebrew word navi, nevi'im is plural, navi, a prophet is not necessarily a future predictor. And we tend to think that way. There are passages, and we have them in Ezekiel, where he seems to know that Jerusalem will fall. And that's an event that hasn't happened yet. But if we look at these 40-plus chapters, that's very little, really, of what he has to say. Most of what he has to say is an exhortation to the people to be faithful to Yahweh, to trust in him, to conduct their lives in a way consistent with that. And so a prophet, as I understand it, is first and foremost one who speaks God's word for the people today. And that word usually has a religious and a moral thrust to it. to be faithful, to trust, to not be discouraged, to sacrifice for the sake of what one believes, and to not take the easy road of consolation. To that extent, prophets in the New Testament exist too. Jesus is the final word of God to all people everywhere. And so to be a prophet in the sense of the New Testament is to speak into the life of our current situation what the gospel says to us. What does the gospel say to us today, here and now? And that may actually have implications for the future. It may actually yield insight into the future. And so, to some extent, I myself, when I preach from the pulpit, I'll preach a little bit later today, I view that as a quasi-prophetic activity, which is a little bit different than the sort of scholarly thing that I'm doing right here. But I have to be very careful, because when I step behind the pulpit, it's a one-way conversation. And I don't want to say anything that's false. So for me, it's a very soul-searching activity to prepare a message. Because if I exhort people to believe things, to do things, I need to be very sure that this is in line with the gospel. And that I'm not just prophesying my own spirit, and that I'm not just reacting to the world. So there's a culture war going on there, but my job as a pastor is not to preach the culture war or to preach politics. There are political implications for the gospel, but it's a little bit different if I get up behind the pulpit and say, now here's who you're going to vote for. I'm certainly going to vote. You'll probably vote. And if you know me, most of you got a pretty good idea probably of what my political views are at this stage. I don't think you're like, oh, Pastor Chad. I think you got a pretty good idea what I think about different things. But, so I do think there's a prophetic office that continues, but it's a little bit different than it was in the Old Testament. That's how I often answer it.
Yeah, no, that's good. One thing, the New Testament calls for evaluation. Paul says, let the prophet speak, but let the others judge. He says, don't despise prophets, but reprove all things. So he's obviously talking about some kind of evaluation when someone claims to speak for God.
Yes.
I'm not always sure. I wish he'd have gone in more detail about actually how you do that evaluation.
Well,
It would be helpful if I
yeah.
knew a little more about how to go about it.
He doesn't really give us a template. I think the underlying idea, though, is that if I preach from the pulpit, in and through Christ's Spirit operative in me, but you all have Christ's Spirit operative in you. So it's not just a one-way conversation. And probably you can tell when you hear something coming from the pulpit or a pastor that does not seem to you to agree with what the Spirit of Christ tells you in your own walk. There's some subjectivity involved in that. But I do think that that involves a process of mutual influence between the pastor and the congregation. And I had congregants come up, after a sermon or a lesson or something and say, you said something that I didn't, that didn't sit right with me. That's fine. That's actually what should happen after a sermon, at least some sermons. I'd hate for it to happen every Sunday. Like, what am I doing up here? I'm just striking out. But no, if a congregant comes up, that gives me an opportunity either to clarify Or I certainly have had times where I've said things from the pulpit that I didn't feel comfortable about later on down the road. I've had to go back and say, oh, maybe that wasn't, something was leading me there. Was that the Spirit of Christ? Is that what was leading me? So I think that kind of humility in exchange is exactly what should be the case. But whatever people say, it should be consistent with the Scriptures. It should be consistent with the Scriptures.
Yeah, and that's really the law of prophecy back in the book of Deuteronomy, which says that the prophet speaks, but they are not in alignment with the covenant, then they're a false prophet.
Yeah.
I think in principle that works in the New Testament. If what they say is not in line with the gospel, then they are not really speaking the truth.
The Scriptures are a way of testing whether things are as they should be. God speaks through our reason. If people start saying things that are illogical and irrational, those things cannot be true. If people say things that run contrary to creation, the good Father's created order of nature, those things certainly cannot be true. The presence and power and activity of Christ in our own life is one of the ways in which He speaks to us. And so I did teach a class a long time ago called God Speaks, and I tried to talk about the different ways in which God speaks to us. Because sometimes in Protestant circles, we treat God like a retired author. Like he wrote a book and now he's just resting on his laurels and he doesn't really have anything else to say. It's like, well, we're very book-oriented. And I'm a Protestant, but really God speaks through reason. He speaks through our conscience. He speaks through the Scriptures. He speaks through the traditions of the church. We don't believe that every Christian prior to our own generation had nothing to say. The traditions of the church have value because the Holy Spirit led the church to do the things that it did. So, tradition. Church tradition is not without value. Religious experience is not without value. Sure, there are traditions that overemphasize religious experience to the point of throwing everything out. But I don't think you can get rid of it. The genuine experience of Christ's presence and activity in the life of a person matters very much. So all of these are different ways, and Paul doesn't go into them at length, as you mentioned, to test and approve of what is or is not a genuine word from the Lord. It takes a lot of discernment. And I think that's one of the reasons why the New Testament says maybe new Christians should not immediately become leaders. Because as enthusiastic and energetic as they may be, the exercise of reason, knowledge of tradition, of Scripture, of religious experience, all of those things take time to cultivate. Wisdom and careful discernment to find out what God's will is for my own life, and certainly if I presume to lead others. It's much safer to presume that probably people only a little bit older will have the time necessary to cultivate those kinds of virtues. That doesn't mean we make a cult of old age, but it does mean that there's something to the idea that older people have an opportunity to gain wisdom that younger people do not always have sufficient time and opportunity to gain. I do believe that. And besides, you can't even become president of the United States until you're how old? Okay. Yeah, so I think Kennedy was the youngest up to a point. Is Kennedy still the youngest president? Well, I have thought, maybe you've had the same thought, we also ought to put a ceiling on, you got to be at least this old and younger than that. so that because there is such a thing as being senile.
Teddy Roosevelt was pretty young.
Yeah, Teddy was pretty young.
I'm not sure. I think Kennedy was young, but not 100%.
But I mean, whatever you think of Kennedy and certainly Teddy Roosevelt, they seemed wise beyond their years. Teddy Roosevelt was incredible intellect, just a powerful man in his own right. He was old beyond his years, certainly. So, I mean, that's a good rabbit trail, because while we're looking at Ezekiel, we have to ask ourselves these questions. How were the people to discern which prophet to listen to and which one to ignore? So many people saying so many different things. And we live in those times right now. People are looking for voices of authority. There's so many forces that want to tear down any kind of authority. But then do they put anything in its place? Or are they just destructive? We don't have time to go into it at depth because I'm almost out of time, but this is about where we want to end. In chapter 14, the elders come to Ezekiel in his house, and they ask him for advice, and Ezekiel is told they've taken idols into their hearts. This is interesting. The elders of Israel are overtly blameless. They haven't openly worshipped idols or forsaken the faith of Israel. And yet Ezekiel is told to tell them, yes, but their hearts aren't right. So how does one win when you're up against a guy like this? They don't practice open idolatry, but they harbor idolatry in the heart. Now that's interesting. You don't find that too much before Ezekiel and Jeremiah. For the most part throughout the Old Testament, outward observance seems to be sufficient. But now we're digging in a little bit and saying, yes, you can outwardly do all the right things and still have your heart in the wrong place. Top of page 42. Speak to them and say, thus says Adonai Yahweh, any of the house of Israel, here's the phrase, who takes idols into his heart, sets the stumbling block of his iniquity before his face, and yet comes to the prophet, I, Yahweh, will answer him as he comes with a multitude of his idols, that I may catch the house of Israel at their hearts, who are estranged from me through their idols. So the elders are outwardly obedient, but they're unrepentant in their heart. They don't really believe everything Ezekiel says, but they still want to avail themselves of his help for their own purposes. And Yahweh says, no, I am not here to be at the beck and call of people who need me for X, Y, and Z, even though they refuse to submit to my authority in other areas. So they get a call to turn away from their idols and their abominations. Now, we don't get a very specific idea of what this manner of idolatry is. What does it mean to take an idol into one's heart? Now that's very subjective. Ezekiel condemns the elders as though he knows very well what is going on in their hearts. And I don't imagine they went along with it. But he uses this phrase, the person who does that, I will set my face against that man, I will make him a sign and a byword, and here's the key phrase, I will cut him off from the midst of my people. That's chapter 14, verse 8. I footnote that karate, which means to cut off, becomes important in Paul's writings too. The metaphor is taken from like a tree or a plant, where you could think of Jesus' parable of the vine, and you're the branches. The life passes through and reaches the outward part of the branch. If you cut something off, then it no longer has access to the life. Karet is a punishment that appears in Leviticus, particularly in one that only Yahweh can perform. So you punish a lot of people in Leviticus. You can fine them. You can throw them in, well, they don't have prisons. You can fine them. You can execute them. Those are the two biggies. Karet means Yahweh does not regard that person as among his people. They might live among the Israelites, or we could, contemporary, they might go to church, they might do all the motions, they might do everything, but Yahweh does not know that person. And he's saying that person is cut off from me. They look like a Christian, they act like a Christian. Yahweh doesn't say they're a Christian. So that whole way of thinking and operating, you find even in Ezekiel here. There are people who look like Israelites, they act like Israelites, they're not Israelites. And why? Because they have idolatry in their heart. They don't really worship Yahweh. They worship other things, even though they go through the motions. So that's a very, very tough one to know how to deal with.
Whether you're worshiping God or yourself.
Yeah, are you worshiping God or yourself or some other thing that it is that you worship? And he's not specific in the passage, except to say that Ezekiel has 4 people who are opposing him. Sort of the public that is skeptical about prophecy, the women who are peddling good vibes, the prophets who are telling everybody what they want to hear, and now the leaders who are actually outwardly doing everything that they're supposed to be doing. But he says their hearts aren't right. Well, yeah, I was saying he's looking more and more alone as we go through this passage. It's like there's not too many people left that aren't brought under his rebuke. We do learn from earlier prophecies that there are people who are faithful to Yahweh in their hearts, and who will be the remnant that will carry the mission of Israel forward. But you get the idea that they're very few. They're not the majority by any stretch. So Ezekiel's not winning the popularity contest here. These days they would probably say he's a hater. He's a hater.
How would the sin of the elders apply to the new covenant? Does God cut off people or bless his people?
That's a not uncontroversial question. Oh, look at the time. I'll say a few words about it because we'll continue and we'll go grab a bite to eat. But Paul does use this metaphor when he talks about ingrafted branches. Think in his letter to the Romans. And he says, I think he's talking to Gentiles. He says, you shouldn't say branches were cut off so that I could be engrafted. He's saying, well, you can say that. He's talking about Gentiles who see that Jews who reject Christ have been cut off and they've been grafted in. But let me actually just read what he says and go from there. Because he does say something that Calvinists and Arminians can spend a lot of time discussing. I'm trying to find the chapter here. It's 11, yeah. Gentiles grafted in. I'll begin in chapter 11, verse 17. Karet is this idea of cutting off. Paul says, if some of the branches were broken off, and you Gentiles, although a wild shoot were grafted in, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, don't be arrogant. If you are, remember, it's not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. You'll say, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast through faith. So do not be proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Now that sounds a little ominous. The kindness, note the kindness in the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but kindness to you. Provided you continue in his kindness, and then he says, otherwise you too will be cut off. That's one to discuss. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. So that's the question. I think Paul's building off this metaphor, cutting off branches, grafting them in, and so forth. On a surface reading, it looks like Gentile believers can be cut off down the road too. They must continue in faithfulness. But if we go into that, we'll be here for another half hour. So we can talk about it over dinner. Thank you.